The Islamic Revolution in Iran remains among the most interesting, though poorly contextualized events of the 20th century, especially among Westerners. Iran had been under soft colonial control dating back to the 1800s and forced into extroverted economic development and political puppetry, all while being stripped of its natural resources by outsiders, most notably oil. Further, two separate attempts at gaining autonomy and establishing democracy were stamped out by foreign powers such as the British and the Tsarist Russians in the early 1900s. Back-to-back world wars further exemplified to Iranians how devastatingly violent and inadequate Western ideologies and practices could be, especially when left unchecked. These powers literally massacred each other in the tens of millions and adversely impacted millions upon millions more well beyond the scope of the battlefields. It's here that renewed energy for Iranian autonomy started to once again gain steam. A number of parties and organizations rose during the post-war period looking to shape a new Iran. Three of note include the National Front, who leaned towards democratic socialist policies, Tudeh, who were communist, and the reinvigorated Mushtahids that sought a more right-leaning religious state. Keep in mind, the British and Soviet occupation did also technically bring Reza's son, Mohammad Reza, to power as Shah. It was the National Front, however, that seized the day through their populist appeal. They won seats in the Majlis, and in 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh was voted in as prime minister by a tally of 79 to 12. This landslide shows how popular this man really was among his peers and people. His Majlis immediately took on important progressive topics of the day. They provided Iranians unemployment and workmen's compensation, guaranteed benefits for the sick. They freed peasants from archaic land contracts. They demanded 20% of land revenue should be used to pay tenants and much more. Most importantly, however, on May 5th of 1951, Mossadegh's Majlis nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and expropriated its assets. No longer would Iran's most profitable resource fill British coffers. Iran, first and foremost, would be primary beneficiary of its own land. In Mossadegh's words to The Hague, he says, and I quote, "Our long years of negotiation with foreign countries have yielded no results thus far. With the oil revenue, we could meet our entire budget and combat poverty, disease, and backwardness among our people. Another important consideration is that the elimination of the power of the British company, we would also eliminate corruption and intrigue, by means of which the internal affairs of our country have been influenced. Once this tutelage has ceased, Iran will have achieved its economic and political independence. The Iranian state prefers to take over the production of petroleum itself. This company should do nothing else but return its property to the rightful owners. The Nationalization law provides that 25% of the net profits on oil be set aside to meet all legitimate claims of the company for compensation. It's been asserted that Iran intends to expel the foreign oil experts from the country and shut down oil installations. Not only is this allegation absurd, it is utter invention." In response to this, the British, already overextended with other colonial issues all over the globe, whined incessantly to the newly formed UN and the international community. How dare a people claim lands and resources within their own national boundaries that the British helped create as their own? The privileged hypocrisy of British colonial ideology is truly astounding in every example. The international community supported Mossadegh and Iran. He was even named Time Magazine Man of the Year. Unfortunately, after placing trade embargoes on Iran, the British eventually found a way to deconstruct Iranian autonomy again. With Winston Churchill, already notoriously brutal believer in colonial abuse as seen in India and Kenya, in power again, British Secret Service MI6 was able to appeal to the US President Dwight D. Eisenhower for an intervention. By convincing Ike that Mossadegh was a low-key communist, they prompted him to use his new Cold War toy, the Central Intelligence Agency, to commit international espionage. The first successful CIA overthrow of a democratically elected government took place in Iran in 1953. Declassified only in 2012, Operation Ajax reveals the complicity of the United States in overthrowing democracy in Iran with aims to re-secure Western control over the nation's oil. The plan consisted of mass propaganda campaigns against Mossadegh, resource distribution, and teaming with militant General Zahedi, and also an incredibly offering support for far-right Islamic groups in hopes of forcing Mossadegh from power. The CIA even worked with these groups to stage bombings of mosques that could be blamed on the National Front and show their disrespect for the religious citizens of Iran. And it worked. A coup led to the ousting of Mossadegh and the invasion of the Seven Sisters oil companies. Now, in addition to the British BP and Dutch Shell Oil, the U.S. was profiting through Standard, later known as Chevron, Gulf, later merged into Chevron, Texaco, later merged into Chevron, Esso, later known as Exxon, and Saucony, later known as Mobil, and of course they combined into ExxonMobil. Ultimately, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was reinstated as the Shah. When Iranians speak of the Shah, it's usually this one. He teamed with U.S. advisors, corporations, and particularly the oil companies to control not just the exploitation of crude, but the development of the country. All future Majlis attempts at nationalization were brutally squashed. The Shah's rule also saw the birth of SAVAK in 1957 under CIA and Mossad tutelage. The internal policing force learned from a 5-man CIA leadership panel how to censor media, hunt down all forms of dissidents, kidnap, torture, and assassinate. Much of this took place at the famed Evin prison. Here, and I quote, brute force was supplemented with bastinado, which is the beating of the soles of feet, sleep deprivation, extensive solitary confinement, glaring searchlights, standing in one place for hours on end, nail extraction, snakes, favored for use with women, electrical shocks with cattle prods, often into the rectum, cigarette burns, sitting on hot grills, acid dripped into nostrils, near drownings, mock execution, and an electric chair with a large metal mask to muffle screams while amplifying them for the victim. This latter contraption was dubbed the Apollo, an allusion to the American space capsules. Prisoners were also humiliated by being raped, urinated on, and forced to stand naked. This comes to us from one of the prisoners, a man named Abrahamian, in his text called Tortured Confessions. Among the worst examples of SAVAK's covert actions rooting out resistance was the accidental drowning of Samad Barangi of Tabriz in the Aras River. This teacher and children's story writer challenged the way people thought during the time. His most famous story was The Little Black Fish, and it explained in its own episode on this channel. In response to the clear unhappiness of the people, the Shah did eventually launch his attempt at progressive reforms called the White Revolution between 1960 and 63. Is a revolution from the top down even possible? Not remotely. That said, as with his father, we would be remiss to add that not all was quote-unquote bad under the Shah, and many Iranians fondly remember some of his efforts. The Shah's White Revolution was too little too late, especially for the resurgent religious communities and leadership. U.S. imperial interests and westernization alienated many traditionalists. Moreover, social pressures proved antithetical to Islamic Shia beliefs and ways of life. Economically, land redistribution took property from mushtahids as Zakat trust lands were repurposed. Entry into the global market as a subservient player also led to rampant inflation, new hierarchies, and financial instability. And like his predecessors, the Shah's accommodation policies to foreigners angered many. The capitulation laws of 1964 not only allowed U.S. exploitation of the market, but forced Iran to follow their lead in foreign relations, compromising the integrity of global ummah given U.S. policies in other Muslim nations. In this atmosphere, Ruhollah Mossawi Khomeini rose to prominence. As a young man, he studied law, jurisprudence, poetry, philosophy, Western and Islamic, all in the city of Qom. He worked his way through the ranks of mushtahids in the early 1960s. As a professor of philosophy, he eventually attained the title of Marja-e Taqlid, which means model of imitation, as an Ayatollah, which is the highest degree of scholarship. From Qom, he issued declarations against the Shah and his White Revolution. His decree to cancel Nowruz, the Iranian New Year, and one of the most favored holidays in the country, promoted protests. His speech on Ashura, another key holiday in Shia Islam, in 1963, compared the Shah to the ancient Khalif Yazid, who ordered the murder of the third Imam Hussein, invoking the collective memory of his actions against the purity of the Prophet Muhammad's bloodline. The Shah's army rolled into Qom and captured Khomeini. Immediate protests led to the death of as many as 400 of his students and caused damage to school in Qom. Further decrees by Khomeini after the capitulation laws forced his exile. He spent time in Najaf, Iraq, but Saddam Hussein expelled him and he ended up in Paris. While in exile, he authored the Hukumat-e Islami Velayat-e faqih, which is the Islamic governance of the jurist. This would be his vision of tomorrow, a synthesis of Shia Sharia law, Iranian nationalism, Western philosophy, and the resurrection and prominence of the ulema, the scholarship. Growing unrest with foreign influence, the effects of capitulation, and inequality in the market that created new socioeconomic problems in Iran mixed with overt secularism, the squashing of tradition, and political suppression. A host of uncommon allies began formal resistance. Religious scholars, a revived National Front, a defiant two-day party, and urban and rural youth added to their populist message the example and work of the Mujahideen-e-Khok, which were socialist freedom fighters, with comrades already playing prominent roles in the running of neighboring Afghanistan. It seemed only one symbol could rally all of Iran enough to really pursue the singular aim of ousting the Shah, though, and his foreign directory. It was Khomeini. Obvious ideological incongruities would have to be settled later. The leftists, under pressure, reluctantly acquiesced, knowing that the draw of this man's message was enough to motivate action. Cassettes of his lecture had been smuggled in through the 1970s, garnering more fame to his martyred status. Further, an old prophecy from the respected Imam Musa in 799 began making the rounds and stated, and I quote, "A man will come from Qom and he will summon people to the right path," end quote. Growing his legend more, as well as the people's anger, his son, Mustafa, was murdered by SAVAK in 1977. The Shah, in reactionary haste, published an anti-Khomeini article called Iran and Red and Black Colonization, accusing the growing unrest as an odd communist/Islamic combined conspiracy. More protests broke out, leading to 2 more student deaths and the injury of hundreds more. They became the new martyrs, and the religious leaders argued their sacrifices watered the tree of Islam, not unlike those that died in Shia Islam's past, like Hassan or Hussein. Demonstrations started 40 days after the Qom incident and led to riots against all perceived symbols of Western oppression, especially in Tabriz, recalling its rich revolutionary past. Each activist death led to what was in Iranian tradition mandatory demonstrations every 40 days. At each demonstration, the enforcing class managed to kill someone, and thus riots were perpetual every month and a half or so. To stop the cycle, the Shah fired SAVAK leaders. The CIA also sought to calm the Shah. They assured him they knew everything about social unrest and Iran was not revolutionary. Boy, were they wrong. The mysterious Cinema Rex fire claimed 422 lives. Each side blamed the other. Non-stop protests guided the Majlis and the Shah to name a new prime minister and rewind some of the overt westernization projects, but it was too late. On Eid of 1978, the holy holiday that ends Ramadan, so many marchers called for the return of Khomeini that the Shah declared martial law. A key turning point in the events themselves as well as global perception was Black Friday. On September 8th of 1978, 5,000 marched in defiance of martial law. General Oviesi ordered his troops to open fire, killing 64 in Jaleh Square in Tehran. Khomeini, from exile, ordered all his supporters to officially cease all negotiation with the regime. Even the Shah was shocked by the actions of his imperial guard and ordered no more soldiers to attend protests, which further galvanized the revolutionaries. Unity peaked as strikes, boycotts, and unchecked demonstrations remained constant. By October, as much as 10% of the adult population was not working and on the march. The BBC went on to feature Khomeini while he was in Paris, making him a household name, and like Mossadegh before him, he was named Time Magazine Man of the Year in 1979. On a related front, the National Front formally signed an accord to work with the religious leaders. Students took to the streets, emboldened by all that was happening. It's known as the Days Tehran Burned. They burned all symbols of foreign influence. The final push came from Iranian women. The Muharram protests, led by the organization Women of Iran, seemed to finish off the regime in December of 1978. The Shah fled the country in January of 1979. The Ayatollah returned home shortly after and began the process of negotiating a new nation. Though violence did break out between 2 competing governments, the other led by Prime Minister Bakhtiar. This is where Khomeini's charisma and speeches reveal the way he initially persuaded popular approval of his leadership. On April 1st of 1979, the Islamic Republic of Iran became a reality. What happens after, from the Iran hostage crisis to the Iran-Iraq War to other failed secret invasions of Iran by the United States and British, like Operation Argo, to the Iran-Contra affair, to the shooting down of Flight 655, which left 290 citizens dead, to the wildly problematic sanctions placed on Iran, to even the US-led computer virus invasion known as Stuxnet or Operation Olympic Games, they all deserve their due research. Please go look them up. That said, I think Houman Majd put it best when reflecting back on revolutionary Iran in his book, The Ayatollah Begs to Differ, and I quote, "For 200 or 300 years, Iran had been, all but in name, a proxy of Western powers, specifically Britain and then the US when it took over the mantle of empire after World War II. Iran overthrew a 2,500-year-old monarchy in 1979 to liberate themselves from an autocratic dictator, as much as to liberate themselves from foreign domination, and for almost 30 years now, more as of this recording, whatever can be said about Iran, it cannot be said that it is subservient to any greater power."